welcome to Ideas at Work and Beyond. I appreciate very much Ivan allowing me to host the show tonight. We have a very special guest with us this evening. Peter Pretorius is joining us all the way from Johannesburg, South Africa. And I had the privilege of meeting Peter 2 springs ago when my wife and I joined him and his wife in Africa to get a front row seat to the ministry that Peter is involved with. Joint Aid Management. They have a website, jamint.com, that has a lot more information. But essentially it is an aid, benefit, mission, and ministry to the entire continent of Africa. And among other things, it feeds on a daily basis 429,000 starving kids in Africa. And when my wife and I joined them over there for that time 2 springs ago, it was absolutely life-changing. So thank you so much for coming. We're very excited to hear more about your work and what you're involved with.
It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to the show.
Well, before we get into some of your work, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the background, your background. I have a 17-year-old son, and he's fascinated by you. Some of the things you've been involved with, the construction business. You had a fairly substantial tobacco farm. You drove Formula One race cars for a while. You were involved with some deep sea fishing competitions. Give us a little synopsis of your background and what led you to be involved in this work.
Well, I guess to really understand that, I need to tell you a little bit about my background and what drives me. Because all the things that Marty has been talking about and things that I've really been involved in were all driven by one factor, and that is my wife actually says I'm an adrenaline junkie. And really it's because I've always gone after things that are exciting, things that somehow, you know, had a lot of life and exuberance in them. And that's how I got into motor racing. It was when I was about 22, I started racing go-karts and then went from there to the smaller single-seater racing cars and eventually ended up on the Formula One circuit in Africa and did that for close to 3 years. And it was pretty exciting. You know, I really loved that. And in fact, even today, I love to watch the Formula One on TV and really just to keep up with what's going on. On the fishing side, and perhaps it's a little difficult to look at fishing and look at Formula One racing and somehow be able to relate
and then somehow segue into how you actually help feed literally hundreds of thousands of children. But we'll get to that.
Yeah, right. But you know, even with the fishing, for me, that was very exciting. I fished for my province. We used to fish in these competitions, and we were doing deep sea fishing, fishing for marlin and swordfish and so on. And we were catching large fish on light tackle, and really also very, very exciting. So
I have to tell 2 quick stories. When Peter and Ann, they're in town here for about 4 nights, and so they're visiting and they're staying with us. And I have the DirecTV with the multiple sports channels. And the first thing he wanted to find is, where's the Speed channel to watch the Formula One race? I guess it was in, what was the race? Bahrain. And a Brazilian one, and that young guy from England came in second.
That's right.
And then the next thing was, I was very excited to show you the marlin I had caught. So I show you this stuffed fish that's out in my barn, and Peter says, he says, yeah, those kind, yeah, we used to throw those back. You know, so these are South African large marlin.
The truth is, if we threw a fish that size back, we'd get more points.
So it was a point.
The fish, so it was a point. You have a very nice.
A very nice fish. I mean, okay. All right. Well, thank you. But now, so you came from a background. Your family had a construction business, and it was a substantial business. You met your wife, Ann. Ann tells the story, or it's told about her, that she came from also a very affluent family in South Africa. She tells the story how she was driven to school in a chauffeur-driven limousine and picked up by the chauffeur in a Cadillac limousine.
One of those Cadillacs with the big fish tails.
Is that right?
So we're talking some years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, she grew up in a very wealthy family. Her dad was chairman of a number of companies, breweries and hotel chains and so on. And she grew up in a very wealthy family, colonial style family, very protected. She went to private school from, grade 1 right throughout her whole schooling was at one school, living in one house. And here's the great thing. When I met Anne, I'd moved 32 times already. I mean, and she hadn't moved. She moved once in all that time. So I mean, our background's so vastly different. My whole growing up had been my dad in construction. We moved where the work was.
Is that how? Okay.
And I mean that's why I moved so many times. Whereas hers was so stable, and she had one set of friends growing up throughout her life.
Right.
And I mean, it was just, our backgrounds are so incredibly different.
Wow.
Mine in the workplace, my dad was really a phenomenal guy, and he taught me so many things. But when I say phenomenal, when I was 25 years old, I would never forget this day. He called me in one day and he said to me, you know what, I've been watching you, he said. And he said, I've become convinced that what you're doing in the company, and I was running all the sites, all the jobs, he said, I can do that, and I can probably do a little bit better than you. He said, but what I've really come to see is what I'm doing in the company, running the company, you can do a lot better than me.
Wow.
So he said, as of today, you run the company, I'll run the jobs. And that was it.
Is that right?
I mean,
so 25 years old, you handed the keys to a multi-million-dollar construction.
Yeah, Marty, he never once came back and questioned and checked, nothing.
Wow.
He gave it to me, and he had the confidence.
Wow.
He was a real phenomenal guy, And he was right. He was right.
He was right. You could run the company.
I could run the company.
Is that right? That's fantastic. All right, so here you are. So you're racing cars, you're catching marlins, you're running million-dollar construction companies, you're doing fantastic. How did you get involved with starving children in Africa? And by the way, for me, this was my first trip ever to Africa. But you go into Johannesburg, it's a wonderful industrialized city. You go to Cape Town, South Africa, and it puts Miami Beach or the Caribbean or any of these places to shame. The gorgeous white sand beaches, it's just an absolutely gorgeous place to go on vacation and develop. So sometimes I think when we think of Africa, we think of, wow, starving people and rather underdeveloped. But I tell you, South Africa is a gorgeous place to visit. But anyway,
even South Africa is unique in this sense. I mean, yes, it does have, our cities are very much like your cities.
Yeah, absolutely.
In fact, the shopping malls are no different to the shopping malls here. Coastline is absolutely beautiful. Cape Town, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful cities in the world.
Crystal clear water.
Yeah, but the amazing thing is, you go just 35, 40 minutes out of the city and you're into the rural part of the country, and people live in grass huts, and people are struggling with poverty. So we very much have this unique blend of first world and third world country.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true.
But then, of course, the further north you go, that blend becomes very much third world and very little first world.
Yeah.
When you leave South Africa and go into the rest of Africa. Your question is an interesting one, and let me answer it.
Sure.
After having been in construction for many years, I was working really, really hard. I guess my whole life I've worked hard, but I was putting in about 16, 17 hours a day. I was having very little of my family. I'd made really quite a lot of money by that time. I was battling to see that the money was worth the time and effort that I was putting into it, and the penalty I was paying with my family life. So we decided to sell the business. And I spoke with my dad. He was virtually at retiring anyway, so he was happy that we do that. We sold the business.
The construction business.
Construction business. And Anne and I moved down to the farm. We bought the farms. We bought 2 farms.
Okay.
And we decided to go tobacco farming. I mean, it was the most incredible experience because neither of us had ever been farming.
Well,
at least I kind of knew what a farm looked like. She didn't know at all. Let me tell you, this was really a city slick girl who grew up in a rich home.
Okay. But just by way of explanation, these farms in South Africa are massive enterprises. I know we went to the wine country there, and some of these vineyards and so forth are huge. But anyway, so you went into the tobacco.
The tobacco industry at that time especially was still a
give us a date. What's the time of date?
Industry. I'm talking around about 1975, 74.
Okay. All right.
You know? And we went down, we bought the 2 farms, we started farming. I knew absolutely nothing about farming, and especially nothing about tobacco farming.
Okay.
But I actually went to the cooperative and I asked them, you know, who are the 2 best tobacco farmers in this whole region? And they gave me the name of these 2 guys, and I called them up. And I said, listen, you know, I know, and I mean, these guys were very Afrikaans, and I couldn't really carry on at that time, especially coming from Johannesburg, a very good kind of conversation in Afrikaans. So they straight away knew I was really, you know, English speaking and whatever, and a city slick.
Okay.
You know. So I called them up and I said, listen, I know this is a cheek, but, you know, I know nothing about tobacco farming, and I'm told you are 2 of the best farmers in the area.
Okay.
And I want you to teach me. And I said, you know what? If you'll teach me, I really will learn.
Okay.
And I mean, they both agreed.
Huh.
And the one said, no, you'll teach me the barns, how to, you know, cure the tobacco through the barns.
Right.
And the other one said, he'll teach me, you know. And I know it was a bit of a cheat, but they really agreed to help me. One agreed to help me with the process of curing the tobacco through the barns, and the other one with the planting of the tobacco in the fields. So, I mean, it was a brand new career, Marty. But you know that within 3 years we won the Shield for the best farmers in the whole region.
Is that right?
I mean, and really, they did a great job. They taught me well. But by the same token, I really learned well. And I think that's perhaps been a strength, you know, to me in my life, and certainly it's helped me in the work that we're in now. And that is that I've always learned well, and it's been easy for me to learn from others, you know.
Okay.
So we were then busy farming, and we were really, you know, beginning to really prosper with the tobacco farming. And then, you know, something amazing happened, and that is my dad suffered from a double heart attack, and he was dying, and, you know, I went up to see him in the hospital, and I mean, I wasn't ready for him to die. And to cut a long story short, God did an incredible miracle and healed my dad. And it actually led to my wife and I receiving Jesus as our Savior. Whereas before that time, I had no kind of interest in God at all. I thought that Christians were just, you know, people who had failed at everything else. And trying God as a last resort.
Okay.
And in the process of, you know, receiving Jesus, we then started to go to a local church. The local church was involved with programs for the poor, but just in our area.
Right.
And, you know, suddenly I realized from them that life wasn't just about ourselves. You know, up until then, I think like most people, we were always getting a business established, or always into a new program, or in the case going farming, into a new career. There was always such focus on what we were doing. And I don't think it's that we were incredibly self-centered or selfish people, but we just didn't go outside our circle. And then when we started to help the local church, I began to realize already, you know, that there really was, you know, life outside of just our family, and that God wanted us to relate with other people and so on. And we then started to get involved in just some local programs with the poor people through our church, just in our surrounding area. And that was our first effort into beginning to help the poor.
Okay.
But it hadn't really got a hold of me, you know. It wasn't a passion, it was something we were helping the church do. We were kind of involved in the church.
All right, so you grew up with a certain amount of affluence, had the construction company, then you went to tobacco farming. You had this encounter with God, you became a Christian, you asked Christ into your life, and then something began to stir in you, and you had more of a heart for the poor. Tell us a little bit about your first trip into Mozambique, and maybe it wasn't your first trip, but your first exposure to real starvation on a mass level, and how that affected you.
Well, you know, we'd heard that there were big problems in Mozambique. We'd heard that there were people starving. You have to also understand a little bit of the history. You know, Mozambique and South Africa were literally virtually at war. I mean, it was never an officially declared war, but South Africa were supporting the rebel group in the country that was fighting the government.
Right.
And there was a huge amount of, you know, friction and so on between the two countries.
My first impressions of Mozambique was their national flag.
Yeah.
And in the flag, in the upper left-hand corner, they actually have an AK-47 rifle on the flag. And I thought, now this is a compelling country that has an AK-47 Kalashnikov rifle on their flag.
That was part of the revolution.
Uh-huh.
And you've got to understand the revolution was the people fighting against the Portuguese.
Okay.
You know, against the colonial power. Then, when the Portuguese left, they became the government.
Okay.
But then a rebel force started to try and oust the government. And that force, it is said, was actually initially supported by the Prime Minister in what was then Rhodesia, Smith,
Okay.
to start, to prevent, you know, Mozambique from helping the rebels at that time in Zimbabwe. So it really began on a political level, and South Africa then took up support of these rebels. And the two countries really, it was so we could never get into Mozambique.
Okay.
We heard things that were going on, but we were never able to get in. And then in 1984, in February, they signed this peace agreement called the Nkomati Agreement.
Okay.
And it was a big deal. They signed it. 2 weeks later, I got a visa.
Okay. So just by way of background, Mozambique, a colonial property of the Portuguese. There's a communist-inspired revolution. They oust the Portuguese. My understanding is they literally, in a matter of days, all the educated management, government personnel that were of Portuguese descent or were involved with the government literally packed up and left. Entire apartment buildings were left, and the government was essentially left to its own devices. At that point, the communist government comes through, and then things really kind of get messed up. As a result of all this governmental upheaval, there's poverty, there's starvation in the land, and that's when you come in. Is that accurate? Or a bit of an overview?
Well, that is accurate, excepting that most of that happened some years before we got in. And then there was this rebel uprising, and that went for a number of years. All this time, the country was really getting destroyed and really pulled down to its lowest ebb ever.
Okay, so 1984,
that's when
you've heard about starvation, it's your first chance to get in. What happened?
So 2 weeks after Nkomati, we got the visas, we went into the country. I was really interested also, you know, in doing gospel work in the country, but that very quickly became evident wouldn't be possible because it was a Marxist-driven country.
Okay.
But I asked them how I could help, and their answer was, if I came back in 2 weeks, they would take me in a government airplane, fly me to this place called Pombara, where there was a food distribution camp. And by the way, that's one of the places you went to where we have the project.
Wow.
It's in that very same village.
Yeah.
And I went back in 2 weeks. We flew up to Pombara, and we arrived there. And you know, I was only supposed to go for the day. I didn't have any toiletries. I didn't have a change of clothes. I had no food with me. We were going to have a look at the problems there for the day, and they were going to fly me back in the afternoon. And then when we arrived there, the pilot of the aircraft told me he had to fly to Beira so that he could refuel the aircraft. And you know, I had this strange feeling in the pit of my stomach when he took off, because we'd not yet left the airport. And he didn't come back. He didn't come back for 10 days. I was totally stranded in that place for those 10 days. And I was right there in that food distribution camp in Pombara. And I must tell you, Marty, it was the most life-changing experience that I've ever had. Because there were about 34,000 people in that camp, and they were all starving to death. The adults, the children, everybody was starving. I mean, I had never come across a situation like that. And, you know, I thought I knew what poor people looked like. I thought we had poor people in our own country. I thought I knew what poverty was. And maybe I did know to an extent what poverty was, but I didn't know what abject poverty was. And suddenly, I was stranded in this place. I didn't have a tent to sleep there. I mean, you know, I had no water. So I had to drink just the local water. Within 2 days, I had the most chronic diarrhea you can imagine from the water that I'd been drinking. I had no food. I mean, it was the most incredible kind of a situation.
And you're not used to this. You've been living in a civilized country and a developed world. This is.
I'm not used to this. Yeah. But what I'm not used to even more than not having, food and a proper place to sleep is people dying of starvation around me every day. I mean, more than 30 people were dying every day, and I was helping bury them. In fact, I was doing more than even the people who were there, because, when people are really starving, Marty, they have no energy, they're apathetic. You can't even get them to move, quickly, because they have no energy at all. We just dug shallow graves in the sand. And I'm telling you, I dug the biggest part of those graves. And we just laid the people. We didn't even have plastic bags to put them in. We didn't have coffins. We just laid their bodies in the sand and covered it up, I think that's the thing that got inside of me first, was that for these people, there wasn't even any form of dignity in dying, And the most incredible thing is the people, the families of these people was different when I was a child. But with the adults, it seemed like they didn't even really have the energy to mourn. And Africans normally mourn their dead, very, very sort of obviously. And on the Wednesday of that week, there came an old man across the clearing, and I could see he was weak and stumbling, so I went and helped him, and I sat him against a tree, and I told him I'd go get him some water. Now, I couldn't have been gone 10 minutes. And when I came back, he seemed to be sleeping. So I kind of reached over and shook his shoulder. I wanted to wake him up. And his head just fell to the one side, He wasn't sleeping. He died while I was gone. And it was like something snapped inside of me. I couldn't handle my emotions anymore. I mean, they were just doing crazy kind of things inside of me. And I just couldn't handle them. I mean, prior to that week, I would have told you that I'm not an emotional person at all. I always used to think my wife is so emotional, but I'm practical.
Right.
And I solve problems practically. I look at things practically. I learned that afternoon that I'm a very emotional person, and that I couldn't even control my emotions anymore. I had to I had to vent this anger that had developed inside me because of these extreme emotions. And there was nobody around that I could really do it with. So I kind of took it out on God. You know, I literally screamed at God at the top of my voice. And I said, Lord, I don't even know why I'm here. I don't know why you have me here. I don't know what I'm doing here. Because these people are dying without food. They need food. I don't have any food. You know, I said, I don't even know if this is your will, that people die like this. I don't even know how you feel. I only know how I feel. And I said, my heart is broken. And then, you know, I really felt like the Lord spoke to me and said to me that, you know, I feel like you feel, and you very, very much more 25 times more so. And that's why I sent you. I want you to help these people. And you know, I still had this long discussion because I actually had nothing money. We'd been wealthy when we came into the work that we had come into. But we'd used what we had to begin the work.